like any good operator, you always red team your vulnerabilities and make sure you got a backup plan. So if this doesn't work, I will be happy to communicate with MadSci. So good afternoon. I know I'm the last thing between you and your flights, your lunch, in that regard, other than Sebastian closing out the event. But my name is Dr. Behlendorf. As was mentioned, I'm from the Center for Advanced Red Teaming. So as you heard early on, the focus on red, starting with the enemy, that is what we spend all of our time on, is thinking about building the art and science of red teaming. I'm a wanderer, so you'll see me walking around. I usually teach between 20 or 400 students, and this is one way I keep them engaged. So I know that's probably unfortunate for the live streamers. I apologize, but I'm a wanderer. Thank you very much. Oh, fantastic. With me today is my colleague, Douglas Clifford. He's in his prior military service. He was an MP, but we won't hold that against him in that regards. But together, we have a center of about 4 full-time staff and 2 professors, myself and Dr. Gary Ackerman. And what we do at the Center for Advanced Red Teaming is, since 2019, we have been focused on how do we think like the enemy and build the art and science about that. How do we weave in what we know from scientific methodologies and approaches, human decision-making, bias, minimization, and a variety of other aspects to address a whole range of problems from the red perspective. Now, we don't just apply red teaming to questions of military interest. As there was an earlier discussion, we need to be thinking about Dynfield, we need to be thinking about a wide range of other approaches and spaces. We've done in the last 5 years 35 different red teaming projects in 14 countries in order to leverage red teaming according to a number of different problem spaces, including things like bioproliferation, aviation security, ballistic missile acquisition, chemical weapons, autonomous technology research, and a range of other complex crises. The reason is the methodologies behind wargaming, behind red teaming, have so much broad application that they can help us in a number of different areas if we adopt an analytic approach to it. Now, I'm going to say an analytic approach, and the first thing you go to is analytic wargaming. I don't want to go there at this point because what I'm going to talk about today about amplifying wargaming analysis is applicable whether you're designing a learning or educational game, or you're designing analytic war game, whether you're looking at a small micro game, or you're looking at something that's to maximize or evaluate large-scale combat operation. One of the other things that also has done is we have worked on developing the science of red teaming in an empirical way, because we do value and look at the importance and value of data. We've run exercises from 20 to 2,000 people, leveraging this from 20 minutes to multi-day red team exercises in a very scientific way. And I know we had some folks talking about AI and LLMs and things that affect. I'm a little bit more skeptical on the AI integration, having served also in a commercial capacity where we red team AI for chem bio risks and see what these models actually do and don't spit out when it comes to their capabilities on chem bio protocols. I'm still a little hesitant about its ability to understand and fully comprehend full-scale military doctrine and operations, but call me a skeptic at this point. Now, in this context, the question that came from the Mad Science Initiative of, hey, can you guys give a presentation at a wargaming conference? Sure, we can do that. And then a couple of months went by. I know we had a discussion. And then they put on the slide, you're going to talk about amplifying wargame analysis. And I said, where do we start? What do we do? How do I not include mathematical symbols in that process, right? And so, working through the slides, Sebastian in the room was tweeting the other day and had one of my favorite comics in this regards, if I'm too far away, from Calvin and Hobbes, right? The truth most of us discover where we are heading when we arrive. And that is most applicable in this presentation because this was done a week ago, submitted, sent, but the themes in here resonate with a lot of the observations that were brought up during the presentation here. And so I hope you see that when we go through the particular presentation. So first thing I want to talk about were some trends and challenges as we think about wargaming and wargaming analysis in this regards. And so we come to this doctrinal split. Now, there are educational war games and there are analytical war games in that regards. But what if you're a commander and you need to understand both not only how you actually model and battle outcome in regards, but also whether your soldiers are able to learn and understand that wargaming literacy, that strategic thinking in that aspect. Moreover, we have this discussion about shifts to inclusion of digital methods. We've heard about it, AI, digital technology. It increases dramatically the amount of data captured in this regards, right? The question is, what data do I need and why? Again, this is not about let's collect everything, because either the last presentation, fantastic. I mean, Warhammer, I'm a big fan, right? Collects boatloads of data. If we think of wargaming and what the ancillary gaming community has, wargaming methodologies are behind the time when it comes to the amount of data that can be collected on decisions during an actual exercise or operation. But what data do I need to analyze and why? In addition, war games are now becoming increasingly more complex. You hear this over and over through this discussion. We have massive multi-tiered war games, but we also need simple assessments in this regards. So how do we, in this regards, yet my commanding officer needs simple results and top-line findings, right? You started to see how this was predicted weeks ago when the slides were being developed, and yet they're resonating with the themes that you all presented and discussed here in this regards. How do I handle complex war games but get that top-line result because I have 3 hours to get an operational answer out to my commanding officer in that regards? There's also discussion about the scale of war games, right? From card-based micro games to multinational, multi-day LSCO games. But in that scale, what can I only analyze what is large and complex? Can you analyze information from a card-based educational game? Other opportunities? Well, it depends, right? Depends on, are you collecting any data in that regards? Now, we also heard a presentation of emerging technology like AI could enable large-scale, massively multiplayer online war games, right? It's a wonderful technology in this regard. My question to you is, what information are they training on, and what are those assumptions? In the previous example, using the ORBAT from RED, what is the RED assumptions in the ORBAT, right? What is the framework? Where are those assumptions? When we talk about wargaming, large scale and incorporation of AI, what assumptions are being baked into the models, and where are they getting their training data? Well, we say we don't have any training data. That's a problem number one in this regard, right? So, what do I got to finish here? How do we think about learning from our war game and how? What can I learn and how? So, in this regards, I want you to think about a war game here as an opportunity to learn not only the outcomes of play, which are always important. What's that top level finding? What's my new target that emerged? The decisions during play, this is where we get into maybe it supports co-analysis, maybe it supports understanding these decisional frameworks and how they arrive there, but also best practices for play. Here's the thing. When we think about wargaming best practices, we have a variety of things that have been discussed, lots of books on the topic. But if we're thinking of wargame as something that can be informed from a scientific approach, I'm not saying science drives wargaming, because I think there's educational aspects. I think there's wargames don't always have to have a scientific foundation, but you can think about developing a science of wargaming. What are those best practices and how do we test and evaluate in that operation? So I want to propose out there that the wargame itself should not only be a methodology, but an object of study. And again, for anyone's interested, I'm happy to send all these slides later on in that regards. Happy to disseminate this. So, if a wargame is an object of our study, we are limited by our assumptions. My first assumption I'm going to put out to you, all wargames should collect data. Every single wargame, from small micro games onwards. Now, doesn't make it easy, doesn't make it simple, but think about how board games have incorporated QR codes into their particular designs. So there's some frustrations with that, but there's some opportunities. Card-based games can incorporate a variety of data collection methodologies. I'm not talking about Big Brother, I'm not talking about, in some capacity that where that data is stored. That's another discussion for another time. But if we think about the way that the world around us is collecting data and how we are not taking advantage of those in the small to large war games that we're playing, we're missing out on an opportunity to not only learn about outcomes and decisions, but also best practices and operational capabilities. And so I also want to highlight here, because this is reiterated, it is an inexact tool. If you haven't read this little paper from Rand in 1952 from Moon, great quote here. It is an inexact analytical tool besides the methods that chemists and physicists use, but is a wide step beyond armchair judgment. I think we keep that tension in mind. This is not physics and chemistry, but we are a wide step beyond armchair judgment. As Polsky and Logel also said in 2019, no method can generate perfect analytical rigor. These are ideal standards, not minimum thresholds. Those are my assumptions coming in. Collect data, realize it's inexact. So how can we amplify wargame analysis? Well, I want to first bridge this by saying we need to learn by analysis. What do I mean by this? In this regard, to learn from and learn about wargames is where we need to think about improving our analysis. Now, as I said earlier, this is not about a comparison between analytic and learning wargames. Analysis can happen and be learned in all types of wargames in this regard. But what analytical methods can we use? This is where when you look at the literature on wargaming, when you look at the literature on how to run wargames, on how wargaming manuals are out there, we kind of fall short on this. Why? Because most manuals spend 80 pages on order of operations and 3 on analysis. Now, this is not the fault of it. It's just that the focus was how do you run a good wargame, but how do you analyze the wargame? What aspects of a wargame to analyze, and how do you conceptually think are not always well covered in a lot of the wargaming manuals, even the ones released in the last few years. Many of them relegate analysis to a step in the process. Rightfully so. You design your study, you look at the requirements from your sponsor, you integrate it into developing and implementing the wargame, and then that step 4 is you finally analyze in this regard. But the limits, this approach as an after action or as one step in the design process limits the types of analysis that can be leveraged within a wargame, which limits our knowledge development. What I want to present to you in the remaining time I have today is to think about what are some ways you can amplify wargame analysis in your own operations without having to bridge mathematical formulas or particular types of models and selections. And so what I want to propose to you was really spurred on this. Now, for those of you who are familiar with this, thank you very much to the RAND group on the report on next-gen wargaming for providing an example of this from the 2016 report. This is a process, a wargame design development process in which a wargame is fully developed. And when we think about analysis, we often relegate it to these tactics, these tasks, these approach, right? This is where analysis comes in on the design side. Might I suggest that what actually should be is all of those. Why? Because you're going through a deliberate process to design your wargame, and the decisions you make on things like consequences, player interactions, number of players, linkages to the AR, customer requirements, all can connect back to the types of analyses you can generate from the same wargaming where you're primarily focused on what's the outcome A or B. So I want to make a suggestion that we should broaden our aperture on thinking about wargame and analysis. So in that regards, how do we amplify? I'm not really that bright of an individual most days, and someone asked me, what's your background in wargaming? Other than the red teaming I do, I say, I live in a house with 5 children and my mother-in-law and 1 shop. So I run a multi-domain war game every day to get access to that, right? And my children are 10 years old and under, right? So that gave me kind of a perspective of how do I apply the KISS principle to this concept, right? So foreshadowing our alien first contact honeycomb ship design as a way for an invading force that was brought up earlier this morning, I want to provide to you a simple acronym of SPORE. Now, this is unfortunately because I've been spending a lot of time in the bioscience and biosecurity community, but I felt it might be a better acronym than POSER, which is also going to be the same. But really, I want to highlight 5 things. I want you to walk away today with thinking about, when I approach the next war game I do, what can I think about from sequence, perception, observation, replication, and experiment? And again, many of this is not novel, this is not new. There have been bits and pieces of discussions here today, but I just want to provide you to walk away. How can I apply SPORE to the next war game I run? So let's talk about sequence. Sequence we're all familiar with, right? We talk about all the time. You have COAs, you have decisional sequences, conflict escalation, escalation ladders, supply chains. They're all simple and complex processes. My question to you, though, is, do you have a mechanism for collecting each step of the sequence? So think about your war game when you're designing. You have teams that have to do a variety of interactions within a single round. And then what data are you collecting on that? Are you collecting the decisional information on the ground? Or are you collecting all of the interactions that are developed during that process between and within teams? And the digital platforms is one way that can make this a lot more efficient. So what are some simple ways? Okay, you're running a tabletop paper-based war game. Have participants outline those incremental decisions they took, a simple 1 to X step. What did I do to get to this decision? It's not revolutionary technology, it's a very simple aspect. And then as part of your AAR, if you don't already have, separate from COAs, separate from a COA analysis, present some of those decision sequence tallies in your AAR. What were the courses of decision-making, separate from, let's say, a COA analysis, that led to that commander making that decision, or that player making that approach? And this ties in later on when we talk a little bit about replication and experiment. Now, there are some advanced methodologies that you can look at this. If you are collecting large-scale amounts of data from a digital wargaming platform, you can start looking at interactions and decisional flow. I won't go into too much of that, but I'm happy to talk later. And you can also, when you want to think about using war games as a methodology for analysis, look at multi-stage decision-making models to inform and get at what are some of the causal aspects of why player X or team Y made decision Z. Second, in this regards, there we go, perception. In the war games that we have run and a lot of the red teaming that we run, one of the first things that we do is we don't just record the decisional outputs, we don't just record the interaction of the tasks. But a key question that often gets dropped in a war game is why? Why did you make that decision? Here's a step. What was the process that you made this? Why? Why did you choose this? What were you trading off on this regards? What were the trade-offs in regards? And so what perceptions shape the decisions of interest, and do you capture them is a very simple question in thinking about designing the next war game. Now, how could you incorporate this? Very simply, you're running a tabletop person-based or paper-based. Just have participants individually note their perceptions pre and post decision. Structure this as individually, write down a little note, have a systematic way of collecting this. And by the way, there are now systems that you can incorporate with paper-based games and surveys where you can have QR codes on pages and make data collection very easily in this regard, so it's not as laborious or intensive. Have them write down their thoughts first, and then gather together as the team to make the decision, and then you record both perceptions before and after. But you can also, in this context, incorporate some of the benefits of the years and decades and centuries of work on survey design and ask some survey questions in this regard. I'm not asking you to put a battery of 800 questions, but 2 or 3 questions in a structured manner in a large-scale war game can leverage a whole new aspect of analysis without actually having to recreate a whole war game or redesign something. Incorporate a simple survey set of questions, and then, separately, when making the decision, what was your probabilistic trade-off and alternatives? Thinking about that perception decision and not just the outcome. Observation. This is where we get to studying the war game itself. Now, there's some really interesting implications here that I'll highlight in a second, but really, we think about the war game and the materials produced and the notes produced. Where does it get stored? Where does it get archived? Do we have standards? This country spends billions on libraries and has a whole slew of librarians and information architects that store all the information on this. And then we go and design a war game, and we don't continue those same standards. We don't have those approaches, right? So do we assess while gaming or only after? What is our context? Simple thing, not just about archiving, but do you have someone, not as a white team, not as a facilitator, and going back to integrating students and getting them involved in wargaming, or early officers getting involved in wargaming, a simple thing of having them observe the wargame and take notes down, can collect information about the flow of information, decisions that are made, and doesn't require them to have to be the facilitator, the white team, the green team in that regards. And then what kind of digital, non-digital documentation of game decisions and discussions? We talked about Discord, we talked about some of these other platforms and incorporating that. More advanced aspects is about creating a formal archive. Really interesting research done by somebody named Reed Polly out of Brown University, who leveraged the wargaming archives from the Rand war games that were done in the 60s and 70s that had very detailed notes, discussions, and things written down, able to help our understanding about conflict and nuclear stability now by leveraging a wargaming that was just documented in paper format in detail and stored in an archive? What information could your command, could your office unlock if you had a formal archive of these? And those digital platforms, the things like what MCU is developing, the things that other agencies are working on, and other can help facilitate this. But make sure, what are you capturing? Are you capturing the decisions or all the notes and discussions that go on? And how can that impact your wargame design? And then if you want to invite an outside party to conduct a systematic observation study of your wargame itself. Now, replication. First thing that came out of the back, get your reps, get your reps, get your reps, right? Replication. Here's one of the challenges that comes in a lot of wargaming design that I see, right? How many reps do you need? What's the minimum number of iterations, right? Many of them, right? Yes, exactly, right? It's yes, we need reps. How many? Here's the problem. We'll spend months or weeks developing a wargame, and then we'll say, okay, I need 100 reps on this, but it takes 2 days to run. I'm only going to be able to get 3 reps on this. So a question I have for you on this is, how often do we optimize our wargame delivery time? How much do we go to simplify our wargame so we can match the pace of battle, so we can match the pace of operations, and maybe in more cases, get more replications in? Replication is never a decisional factor in thinking about the design of any wargame. We design the wargame, this is what we need. Oh, it takes 3 days? Okay, well, we'll only run 1. What if I could do the same thing in 1 day and run 3 or 4 or 5? Second, how do we split the delivery size of this particular kind of wargame to maximize those iterations? If I'm thinking about a wargame that may ultimately result in a multi-stage decision about some sort of conflict outcome, do I need to, but I can only schedule people for 1 day, can I split my wargame into 2 separate days to run? And what are the trade-offs on my analysis? So more advanced in this regards, we heard this already. The board to digital design, the tabletop to the digital engagement. But also, and this is something that we talk less frequently about, but you have synchronous, you have staggered, synchronous, or in-person synchronous, synchronous staggered, and asynchronous type of war games. War games are usually about collaboration and cooperation in person, as Sebastian mentioned earlier about really the purpose of war games. But there's also a whole host of other types of games that are out there that maybe straddle the difference between a in-person war game on collaboration and some more of the other gaming type environments that we've seen that can incorporate the asynchronous delivery into this context. Lastly, experiment. Now, this is not experimentation as a formal aspect of wargaming. This is not about discovery, which a lot of times in wargaming, I'm talking about take your wargame design, modify it, run it again. Because if you have 100 different decisions that went into designing your wargame, it is susceptible to bias on 100 different vectors. But if you can say, I'm going to design a wargame, we'll make it simple, and I'm going to experimentally manipulate something about the wargame and run it again, you can compare whether change in that decision change the overall results in your analysis. And guess what? Now you go to your commander with the ability to say, here's the answer. We ran it 3 times. We even changed one thing here and got the same results. How more confident are you in those results when you're going to your command? A lot more. This is now being built into the formal study of wargame experimentation by folks like Reddy and Schneider and Lynn Greenberg and the Project on Nuclear Gaming, where they're able to incorporate repeated war games over 400 or 500 different players, repeated 100 times, and you can start to see to what extent those decisions have. More importantly, if you think that there's a theoretical factor that influences the decision, some aspect of force capability, some aspect of logistical capability, and you make an experimental modification on that and run the game again, now you have an ability to say, to what extent was that applicable or not? Some more advanced aspects, you heard about human and AI teaming, right? Now again, I am skeptical but hopeful on the AI aspect, right? Trust but verify in this regards. But in this context, there are opportunities that if you can talk to me about human and AI teaming, it could provide a tactical advantage, but I needed my baseline. What's my baseline on this? To what extent is it always better than human side. And then the last thing is something I call conjoint-based war games, right? So most people here are familiar with A/B testing. Companies do it. You like this website, you like this website. What you don't know in the background is they're randomizing things about the website, the color, the design, something to that effect. And they're doing that randomization because then they show you another set and another set and another set. And in that context, by randomizing those features in the background and doing this over, let's say, 1,000 participants, they can identify causal elements to say, if this feature is here, 80% of the people are going to click. But if that feature is there, only 40% of the people are going to click. Why don't we apply this to our wargame design? Think about 3, 4, 5 features in your wargame. Run 8 to 10 instances. Again, if you're running a big LSCO, probably not feasible if you're running much smaller. And then see which impacts featured in being able to influence the overall outcomes and decisions made in that wargame. So, just in summary to end today, score, sequence, focus not just on outcomes, but the pathways from which they emerge. Perception, capture perceptions, not just decisions. Observation, study the wargame itself as well as results. Replication, because no two games are alike, ensure that there's at least 3. This was great, Peter Perla quote, because there's no 2 games are alike, it's impossible to, great, give me 3. In that case, at least 1 pair might be alike. Give me 4, give me 5, give me 10. And then no one right game, there is no perfect game. So use differences to distinguish outcomes. Now, I want to end today with a probing thought for you thinking about this and how to amplify our wargame analysis. Because there's been a great discussion about we need an ecosystem of games. From small micro games to LSCO, large scale, multi-domain. Here's my challenge to that. An ecosystem is a set of concepts and entities that are interrelated and interact with one another. And whose interactions can be studied and assessed to identify not only features about the ecosystem, but also emergent properties. My question to you is, if I put together a set of games, but I don't think of how my tactical games here interact with my strategic games there, if I don't have a framework for understanding the interaction of those different games and the things they're trying to assess, then what you don't have is an ecosystem, you just have a catalog. Okay? And so my challenge is, if we want to move towards having broader application of wargaming, more integration and analysis capabilities, we have to think not only about cataloging our games, but what are the different aspects of combat, supply, logistics, operations, intelligence, across multiple strategic, operational, tactical, and how we build a framework to spur new gaming in the gaps and areas between. So I know I've kept you here. That was shortest I've talked in my life. So I'm happy to take any questions.
Hi, I'm Allie. I am an orthodox at CREA, and I love all of this. One of my favorite things about digital gaming is the aspect of being able to collect a ton of data, and it's decently normalized, and it doesn't have a bias, and it's quantitative as opposed to somebody sitting there and taking notes on a piece of paper watching the war game. I guess my biggest question is, when it comes to digital war games and collecting that data, and especially analyzing human decision making, how is that data affected by the decision flow of the program? In a game, you can only make certain decisions, and it's programmed that way. So you can't actually analyze everything that you could when it comes to a board game. So how does your data show that? Does it affect that? How are you even looking at any of that?
Great question. You're talking about game design and game metrics and the interaction between them. And I first want to challenge that data is not unbiased, because every data out there has some sort of assumptions or bias built in to its modeling, unless you're dealing with a physics engine, right? Until you start introducing things like weather and other aspects. But we'll not cloud the physics engine in that regard. But something to think about in this is, what is the purpose of the game? Are you looking for averages and means? And you want to focus on collecting a large number of samples? You can see what is the best solution, the average solution, what is the modal response? Or are you looking for the outliers? Because game design that will put artificial caps on certain moves aren't good for capturing outliers in this regard. So maybe if you're interested in that novel creative solution or that novel creative threat, you don't start with a digital game design, you start with your tabletop, you run that, and then use that to inform what are the upper and lower bounds of decision-making within the game, and then run that 100 or 500 times in the digital gaming environment to see then what happens in that ultimate result. Because a lot of things, it's going back to the processing flow of wargame design as part of a decision-making framework. We heard earlier about how this insights can be incorporated into their reporting to their commanding officer and integrating in that. We have to think about our wargame designs as an integrated flow that may be tabletop here and digital there. But where that flow will hit and how it shapes our design and selection of metrics and data to collect is really a function of what's the overall purpose of the game. So the other thing that I will highlight, and I want to highlight something that was mentioned here, we need, a game for this approach, we need a game for that approach. Everyone will try to sell you on a uniform standard. Here's our one game solution to sell it all. And the problem is you're trying to achieve outcomes that were never intended for the design of that game. And so while you can build common operating pictures and build common models and approaches to the game that can get at a large space, you really have to think about what's my ultimate outcome and what game I select before you get to even a platform or implementation of that. I hope that answered your question.
Yes, Dr. Behlendorf, excellent presentation. I'm familiar with your website. My favorite part of your website is the Red Team Radar.
Yes.
Do you have the slide up here? And how does SPORE relate to that? Because that's kind of a procedural checklist in a radar plot sort of depiction.
Great question. On our website, we have something called the Red Teaming Radar about all the different applications and where red teaming that we use in this regard, and thinking about it as a tool, methodology, and approach. Where does SPORE fit in that regard? SPORE emerged from a 10 p.m. to midnight rush to put slides together for the presentation based on readings. So I haven't yet thought exactly about where SPORE fit, but I'd like to be transparent in that. But again, it's thinking about how do we build, whether it's SPORE, whether it's something else, how do we build processes and tools to design better war games and incorporate analysis, regardless of whether it's learning or educational, into our war games design, implementation, and post-game reporting. What I didn't get into in this regard is everyone's talking about educational and learning war games. My question to you is, how do you assess that?
Learning value?
How do you measure that? Right? What's the process by which? There's a whole science of metrics of learning that can be incorporated. I'm not advocating for that, but thinking about what is our outcome, even in a learning game, and how do we want to measure or assess that? And it doesn't have to be quantitative, it can be qualitative, it can be, in any kind of regard, but we have to think about incorporating that analysis into our design.